Hello, and a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us, making the right choice to join us here in Channel 1. I'm Shashank Joshi. I am the defense editor of The Economist, and I have an excellent panel here with me to discuss the subject of NATO in an era of great power competition. I just want to frame this discussion very, very briefly by saying a few words. To me, great power competition means two broad things. First of all, it indicates the way in which defense ministries, armed forces, and of course, governments more broadly have reoriented themselves over the past couple of years away from the non-state challenges of the post-2001 era towards what we sometimes call near-peer competitors, big countries, big rivals, systemic rivals. The other aspect of it is, and I think this is very important, the emphasis on competition. It's great power competition, not great power conflict. And I think this challenges countries, armed forces and alliances that for a long time have thought about either clear thresholds between peace and conflict, and in NATO's case, have thought very, very hard about deterrence, deterring conflict, in NATO's case, very rigorously over the past 4 years, particularly, perhaps less so about peacetime competition and how that competition can be intense in scale, in scope, in the variety of means in which big powers are competing, and in challenging our traditional ideas that there is a sort of deterrence is what you do in peacetime and conflict is what you do in wartime. So I hope we say a little bit about both of those dynamics. China looms very large on the first part of that, but I think it isn't just about China, it's also about the way in which competition unfolds in a way that is different to the way it's occurred in the past 10 or 15 years. So with that, let me go over to our fantastic panel. We'll begin with Alice Ekman. Alice is an Asia analyst at the European Union Institute of Strategic Studies, EUISS. Alice, please do kick us off. Hear you very well.
Great. So I would like to go back to your comment because we tend to indeed agree that great power competition has shifted from traditional competition between states to non-traditional competition between different international actors, including big companies, including diversity of non-state actors. But actually, I would like to go back to this because more than ever, I think state competition is at the center, is really structuring the current global balance of power. And as a China analyst, I would like to underline why, in my opinion, the rise of China brings a set of challenges that are directly of relevance to both the EU and NATO. What are the challenges related to the rise of China, in my opinion? First and foremost, clearly, it's a structural challenge. By structural challenge, I mean the fact that China is openly against the alliance, the concept of the alliance, and the alliance system itself. China doesn't, under Xi Jinping, since its arrival to power at the end of 2012, China doesn't want to build an alternative alliance system. It wants to promote a more flexible circle of friends, according to Xi Jinping's own word, something more flexible, a flexible type of partnership that will step by step indirectly erode the alliance system, existing alliance system, of course, including NATO allies. By this, I'm pretty confident to say this because it said black and white in various official documents, and also because Chinese think tanks themselves say that alliance is, I would say, it's a backward, it's an outdated concept, it's a burden, it's rigid and not suitable to the current geostrategic context, etc., etc. So first and foremost, we have this structural challenge because why concretely China is challenging the alliance system? Because China more and more is proposing initiatives. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013, then the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, in 2014, then the Belt and Road Forum that is held biennially since 2017, etc., etc. And these initiatives are proposed to a diversity of countries, including allies. So it creates transatlantic tension among allies about who is part of this initiative, who is not, will you join or not. And now more than ever, you have tension around technology, including what you know, first and foremost, 5G. So first of all, you have a structural challenge. Now more than ever is emerging a technological challenge. We talk a lot about 5G, but 5G is just the tip of the iceberg. At a time of tech decoupling, and I really think that we entered a period of technological decoupling with the US being concerned about the diversity of Chinese technologies and publishing an entity list, listing these entities considering that are posing security concern. But at the same time, MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce of China, replying with its own list of entities, including US entities that it considered unreliable. So there is a tit-for-tat dynamic now that is emerging, and it's not just about 5G, it's about data center, it's about submarine cable, it's about blockchain, it's about surveillance cameras, it's about the whole smart city ecosystem. And I would like to emphasize on the word ecosystem, because more than ever, China considered that it has now to innovate, invest in R&D, so that it should be less dependent on foreign technologies and first and foremost US technologies. Not only to be able to be more autonomous, but to be able to promote fully compatible, interoperable technological ecosystem to third market, including Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc., etc. And a two type of ecosystem or bipolarization of the tech environment is currently emerging. And I must say, independently of the result of the US election, and independently of the result of the next US election in 2024, Xi Jinping will likely still be in place and really looking long-term at a full tech decoupling. I'm pretty confident in saying this, and this is posing a certain number of challenge to the EU as well as to NATO allies. I won't be too long, but I just want to underline briefly two other type of challenges. One is political challenge. We have seen at time of COVID that there is a battle of narrative that's going on. The previous session was widely talking about this. And really, it's more than just public diplomacy or propaganda. It's about competition between political system, between economic governance. And China, the Xi Jinping, is confident that it should promote its own political and economic governance model far beyond its territory, and is very keen to underline the weaknesses of Europe, of the US, and will continue to do so in the coming years. So the ideological dimension that we were noticing during the Cold War is coming back and will remain independently again of the result of the US election that we know now. But already in 2013, Xi Jinping was talking about this competition between political systems, explicitly mentioning that according to him, socialism is superior to capitalism. Whatever the label whatever the definition we put behind this word, there is, as framed by the Chinese official discourse, already a competition between political system that is extremely tense and that is waiting on all type of crisis and international event. And the last challenge is the economic challenge that is resulting from COVID-19. Now, the real question in the present context is comparative recovery of global powers at a time of pandemic and post-pandemic period. China seems to recover now, step by step. Of course, there is a large part of public diplomacy and propaganda around it, but already now, I mean, you have business that are opening again, you have figures that are rather positive, and this will lead China to consolidate in comparative perspective its rank as the second largest economy in the world, with the hope to become the first largest economy in the world before 2035. This leads to a certain...
Can we wrap up in a second?
Sure. All this to wrap up to say that the technological challenge that I mentioned first is serious, because if supported by significant economic capabilities, and if China recover more quickly than Europe or the US, the balance of power will shift, and we should not underestimate the rapprochement between China and Russia that is waiting certainly in this balance of power today.
Thank you so much. That's enormous food for thought there. I expect more than we can digest in the time allotted to us. Amrita Narlikar is the head of the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Amrita, a very warm welcome. Please continue that conversation forwards and take us in the direction you'd like to head in.
Okay, thank you very much, Shashank, for getting us off to a great start, and great to have the inputs from Alice. I want to pick up on the point that Shashank made on competition and conflict. And one of the things that regulated competition and conflict in the last 70 years or so, post World War, was multilateral institutions. And NATO happens to be one such multilateral institution. And so I want to pick up on what the problems of multilateralism are. Why is the rules-based order under threat? Where are the threats coming from? And how does NATO fit in? So multilateralism has had problems pre-Trump, as we all know. And history, if written with due diligence, will not judge multilateral institutions, most multilateral institutions, kindly for their dealing with at least the first months of the pandemic. This is true for the World Health Organization, this is true for the World Trade Organization, and so forth. And the problem that multilateralism, that rules-based system that had served us well for so long, for several decades, the problems that this rules-based system faces are threefold. First, multilateral institutions were just not built for a world where those very ties that were meant to bind countries together into prosperity and thereby peace could be weaponized. And the assumption was that through increasing trade, we would get more socialization. And today, it is clear that this is not the case. And as the pandemic has shown us, countries are willing to weaponize global value chains, even health chains, sometimes with life and death consequences. The second problem that multilateral institutions face today, and that rules-based order that they're supposed to uphold, is of narrative, something that Alice also mentioned. And the problem here is that all those of us who support multilateralism just haven't done a very good job in explaining to people why multilateralism matters, why it matters to them. We live in this very comfortable Brussels bubble, Geneva bubble, New York bubble of international organizations. And so other types of narratives, populist narratives, the WTO is the worst deal ever made type of narrative did have greater resonance in contrast to the technocratic ones. And the last problem is that multilateralism seems to have lost its purpose, because many of us who talk about multilateralism speak about it as a good in itself. But multilateralism is just an instrument, right? And we need to have a cold, hard think on what are these multilateral institutions for if we want them to function well. And this is where NATO gets interesting. Because if we're going to talk about, for example, trade, and who do we want to have deep integration with, we probably want to have deep integration with countries with which we share some values, countries that we can trust. And NATO is one of the few multilateral institutions that has acknowledged the changes to the geopolitical, in fact, the geo-economic landscape, by recognizing the importance of having solid narratives to counter misinformation, by recognizing that the major shift, power shift that is underway with the rise of China, a country that does not share its values of many of the members, of many of the allies, and NATO has been calling for global partnerships with like-minded countries to work together. And I think I'll stop there, Shashank, but I'm very happy to go into this further later on in discussion.
Thank you. Joshua Walker is president and CEO of the Japan Society. Joshua, you're in a position to perhaps pull our attention to Asia Pacific more tangibly. It does occur to me, listening to Amrita speak, of course, as well, that when we talk about NATO as a multilateral institution, it's a kind of multilateral security institution that many of those like-minded countries in Asia would bite their own arm off to have, and have, and for various historical reasons have not had. But how do you see their position relative to NATO as China looms large to Europeans, And as some of those ties sort of some of the issues that we're discussing, cybersecurity, space security, information security, become less geographically bounded and therefore perhaps less rooted in Europe.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all joining this conversation. We certainly can't discuss all of this, and I hope it's just the beginning of a much larger conversation that needs to happen. I think that the main point you just raised, and my fellow panelists also raised, is the decreasing importance of geography. You know, even the fact that NATO is now outside of the North Atlantic space is a significant here. I think in some ways the transatlantic century has given way to a trans-Pacific century. The largest economies, the largest populations, the largest security concerns are increasingly in the Asia Pacific. And so when you talk about great power competition and where NATO can have a bigger role, I think you're absolutely right in asking the question, where's NATO going to be and what the traditional allies in Europe. They're not our traditional partners that define World War II. It's what's going to define the next 75 years. And I think COVID in some ways has sped that process up. And so when I think about a country like Japan, the third largest economy in the world, that has a lot of connectivity and connections to the United States and to Europe, and when I think about India, the largest democracy in the world, when I think about Australia, these are the areas we need to be thinking about, because if we are going to have a competition with China or Russia, it can't simply be focused on the North Atlantic space anymore. It needs to focus in the Pacific, and particularly some of the points that Alice and Amrita brought up about how do we make the case for multilateralism? How do we think about competition beyond the security realm? Of course, this is a security alliance, but security is becoming more gray. Where does geotechnology and cyber fit? Economic security, how do these pieces come together? And it's not just big alliances or big countries, it's also public companies. In America, for example, a lot of our cybersecurity infrastructure is not by the Pentagon, it's by GAFA, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebook. You saw the enormous outsized influence that these companies had, private companies had, on the US election process. How do we as democracies deal with that? There's not one size fits all, the way the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese deal with this. We have to learn from each other. And so I believe that rather than thinking about this as kind of how do we just continue the system on and make it relevant, we've got to adapt. We need to think about major change, as we've been talking about throughout this entire conference. But I would simply submit to you that we have to think outside of operations. It's not just about Afghanistan. It's not just about what can the alliance do in specific security areas, but in much broader areas of cooperation. And NATO is doing that. When I think about NATO and Japan cooperation, when I think about Indo-Pacific areas of operation, there is a lot more, there's a lot more to be done, and we're just at the beginning of that.
Joshua, thank you very much. Can I pull that conversation therefore back to Alice? And we've had a question about from Jose Maria Gonzalez in Mexico asking, should NATO focus more on partnerships with like-minded countries in the Asia-Pacific region? What I'd like to ask you is, specifically, are there any types of collaboration or cooperation that you think are going to be particularly productive or useful? I mean, partnership is a very generic idea, and in theory, no one can be against partnership with these countries. I just wonder if you have any sort of ways to make that more tangible. What areas do you think are most promising here for NATO to explore?
Sure. First of all, I think partnership is a good word to use because we are moving towards a more flexible type of alliance system that take different form, different format. We could talk about the Quad. We could talk about ASEAN Plus format. We could talk about different dialogues such as Shangri-La dialogue, etc., etc. So, looking at partnership in different formats from very flexible ways and trying to build bridges between agendas of various initiatives and priorities is already key, because at the same time you have China, who is investing in security governance in the region and beyond, in partnership with Russia. We could talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We could talk about the diversity of forums existing in the region, where some issues are on the agenda and some are not. And more than ever, institutional building is important. So there is, first of all, a global governance dimension to this dynamic. But most of all, I see two areas of cooperation among partners. First of all, technological sphere. Of course, we mentioned it before, but more than ever, it is key to look far beyond 5G to think about interoperability between different technological services and products, but also talking about norms and standards. Because as you know, technology is not just about civil use. There is also potential military use to many technologies that are currently under competition shaped by different state proposals. And the second, I think, area of cooperation that is very important, it's a cooperation on concept and definition. And it's not just an academic debate. What is responsibility to protect? What is human rights? What is regime change? And because all these keywords are now redefined by China and Russia in key international security architecture, because they're unhappy with this concept and hopes that they can mean different things, so to counter attack on the criticism that they're facing under this concept. So if we don't commonly agree on the definition of the words we are commonly using and sharing in international environment, then why are we becoming like-minded? Why are we like-minded if we don't have shared common definition? That's very key. And beyond like-minded partners, I think it's very important to reach out to other type of countries. Actually, I don't really like this like-minded terms because, in front of, in this great power competition, you have a very active China that is talking about enlarging its circle of friends, meaning it's a very accountant-based diplomacy, reaching out to any state possible. It's important to have a long list of states, because sometimes even a state that doesn't weight much in terms of military capabilities or economic weight still have a vote in a key international organization and within the UN system. So in that competition, accountant-based, I would say, competition between partnerships, circle of friends, alliances, etc., it's important not to neglect countries towards which we cannot say really like-minded. And I think it's important to have this in mind, also on the technological front, to propose ecosystem, including urban smart city ecosystem, to countries who are not like-minded partners, including partnering between, for example, European countries and Asian countries who are like-minded countries to develop projects in third countries who are not like-minded countries per se.
Thanks. Amrita, can I turn to you? There's a question from Tinatin Japaridze about whether NATO members and allies should be concerned about growing Sino-Russian cooperation. And the question is about the digital domain, but I think it applies more widely. And the reason I wanted to ask you is because, as someone who thinks about world order questions quite a lot and multilateralism, and what is your sense broadly of the degree of alignment in Russian and Chinese positions on security issues, and is it of a degree and a kind that you think is becoming a serious issue for NATO as a European-based alliance?
Thank you very much, Shashank. Tough questions. Also, thanks to the person who sent in this excellent question. Shashank, I would also like to pick up very briefly on what Alice was talking about, like-minded, if I may.
Do. Yeah.
Because I actually think the term like-minded is very helpful. And and NATO, in the NATO discussion, we're going beyond, considerably beyond the discussion that we have in many other international organizations. Because when you talk about values, in the case, for example, of the WTO, you immediately go in the direction of labor standards and environmental standards, which is quite narrow. And when we're talking about like-minded partnerships here and the kinds of countries, the names that have come up, it sounds more like countries that share macro level values, which deal with democracy and liberalism and pluralism and freedom of the press and rule of law and so forth. Having said that, I think it's also very important that if we look for like-minded allies, if NATO looks for like-minded allies, partners, not allies, but partners, we have to get out of that old rut that we were in, which was always the West defines liberalism. No, there are countries, there's Japan, there's India, there are several other countries in Asia which have powerful traditions of liberalism, of pluralism, and so forth, right? So it's about treating these partners more eye to eye. And now picking up on that excellent point on Russia and China, here how far gone is the link, is the closeness between Russia and China? And I think NATO could play a really important part here, because it is a tough balancing act. You speak to Indian negotiators and practitioners, as I know you do, Shashank, but there the message is very clear, which is that with your sanctions, Europe, you drove Russia into the arms of China, right? Now, of course, all that Russia has done cannot be condoned either, but NATO could play an important role potentially, of walking that balance and ensuring that not the entire global south is driven into the arms of China, and Russia, which is an important balancer, is not driven into the arms of China.
Amrita, thank you so much. And we only have a couple of minutes left, I think. So, Josh, if I could turn to you finally, just to wrap us up, perhaps very, very briefly. As someone who thinks a lot about Japan, knows a great deal about Japan, and the security environment that it's in, I just wonder if you could, if you were sort of looking at lessons from that country's own emerging competition with China over the last several years, and neighboring countries as well, what lessons would you offer NATO from that experience? Does anything jump out at you?
Yeah, the first thing that jumps out at me is poking the dragon is dangerous. Taking your finger and sticking it in the eye for the sake of doing it never pays off. Japan has been in a long history, thousands of years. It's always been on the little side as a small island nation off of this great empire. But over the last 100 years, obviously, Japan, from an economic and kind of military perspective, has advanced. And so now it's in a very interesting situation where its largest security ally is with the United States on a collision course with its largest economic partner in China. In some ways, all of Europe and NATO is in the same bucket here. It is good for China to invest. It's good that the Chinese economy is growing, but it represents a clear and present danger, as we've heard throughout this conference, to certain liberal values that I agree 100% with the panelists, that you can't assume the Western way of doing things is the only way. In Asia, there's a real sense that there's a hubristic tone to American and Western thinkers. So listening and also being clear with your intentions and being able to have a clear understanding of what your security alliances are, what you're willing to go to war over, and what you will do if they take certain steps. We're going to see that in a significant way in the Taiwan Straits, in Hong Kong. So the question is, where do the Europeans, Americans, the transatlantic, and the trans-Pacific like-minded allies come together on here? So I think that the Japanese experience is very instructive. You don't see the Japanese out in front, but they're very quietly behind the scenes. They want to find ways to partner more with NATO. I hope that countries like India, Japan, Australia, the other Indo-Pacific countries come together. It's not just the Japanese way of doing it. It really is more of an Asian approach as opposed to a more European or maybe American transatlantic approach. So I think that we are going to see more of this play out in the next 10 years. The world, all of us watching today, are going to spend a lot more time thinking about Asia. So I'm glad that NATO's having the conversation now. We have a lot more to discuss, obviously, so we can have more solutions, not just the excellent questions that have been raised today.
Joshua, thank you so much. I think there's more there than we were possibly able to get into. I'm just thinking here about Alice's comments about state competition and resilience. And I think the point about tech decoupling and the way that interacts with the question of resilience, which is the subject of another, I think, breakout panel, is very, very important. Amrita, on the thinking about NATO in the context of other multilateral institutions and how multilateralism has fared, and Joshua's points on the Asian way. So thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Joshua, for your time. And I think we'll have to close it there.